Hello, Iowa. It is great to be back in beautiful Council Bluffs with thousands of hardworking, great American patriots. Thank you.
I'm Julie Pace, Washington Bureau Chief for the Associated Press. And this is Ground Game. All of the attention in Iowa may be on the Democrats, but there's a Republican caucus happening next week, too. Unlike the Democratic race, which is far too competitive to predict, it's a pretty safe bet that President Donald Trump will win the GOP caucus.
These are very dishonest people. Democrats are trying to overthrow the last election because they know they're not going to win the next election. That's all it is.
But it's still a test for Trump's re-election campaign as his team looks to tout its new organizational strength. In the coming days, dozens of Trump aides and surrogates will fan out across Iowa ahead of next week's caucuses. Trump will be there, too, for a rally in Des Moines. It's what Trump, ever the TV producer, might call counter-programming in a state that's seen an awful lot of Democrats over the past year. AP White House reporter Jill Colvin has been covering Trump since the start. Jill, thank you so much for joining us on Ground Game.
Thanks for having me.
So, Jill, I think a lot of our listeners might not even know that there's a Republican caucus in Iowa in addition to the Democratic caucus. What is the Trump team's plan over these next couple of days?
Well, yeah, we've had all the focus over the last couple of months focused on the lead up to the Democratic caucuses. Finally, people are going to be caucusing. They're going to be voting. We're going to get our first indication of kind of where the party is leaning with very little attention to what the Trump team has been doing. And what they are trying to do here, at least, is to make the show of force next week in Iowa. They are sending more than 80 surrogates to the state. The president's going to be doing a rally. The vice president's going to be doing a bus tour across the state. And what they want to be doing here is trying to a number of things. They want to distract attention from the Democrats. They want to try to get some hype among Republican voters there because, you could have a situation where on election night, you've got all of these images of, a lot of enthusiasm on the Democratic side, rooms full of voters in these schools and these other caucus sites versus the image of, these empty classrooms where Republicans don't feel like they need to turn out because there's no competition on the Republican side. So they want to avoid the optics of those empty rooms, but they're also really using this as sort of an organizing test run. The caucus process is incredibly complicated. You need to get volunteers and state party officials out to all of these nearly 1,700 caucus sites. It's a huge organizing endeavor. And what they're hoping to do is sort of test their muscles, use this as a test run for November.
Because, Jill, you have covered, as I mentioned, Trump since the very beginning. This is a very different lead up to the caucuses where Trump doesn't have any competition now versus last time around where it was quite competitive and he had a little bit of a ragtag operation, right?
Oh, yeah, it's amazing. I was talking to one of the guys who's running Trump's campaign down there now, and he says that at this point, we're only in January of election year. He actually has more paid staffers on the ground now than he did in November of 2016.
That's amazing.
Yeah, it's just a totally different game. The Trump campaign this time in 2016 was just sort of this ragtag bunch of people. They claimed they were organizing in Iowa, but they weren't really. I remember going out with some campaign volunteers and knocking on doors, and they were really excited that they sort of had an app where they could, basically click the address that they'd been to and share that information. And now the Trump campaign is just this humongous, very highly funded operation with all of these digital tools, all these paid staffers. It's just a totally different ballgame. And what they want to do now is sort of a shock and awe, show everybody what they've got, partially to scare Democrats and be like, what happened last time? We can beat you again.
Based on your reporting with the campaign, is it real? Do they have a real organization?
Yeah, look, they've got people on the ground. They're at quite an advantage because right now all of those Democratic staffers on the ground are all competing against each other. There are, different loyalties. I had one staffer tell me that every time a Bernie Sanders or a, Elizabeth Warren volunteer says anything, speaks to any voter, it's actually advantageous to the Trump campaign because they see this is really a fight for more moderate voters. They hope that their belief, at least, is that, the Trump base is locked in. Very liberal voters are obviously going to vote for Democrats, but they hope that they can win over some of those independent voters, some of those folks who might, in their opinions, kind of be scared off by the kind of economic policies that some of the more liberal Democratic candidates are pushing. And they hope that the more that Iowa voters listen to those candidates, the more turned off they are.
And certainly Iowa, a state that in the last couple of presidential elections has swung Republican, but is still very much a swing state and one that Trump is going to need to win in November.
Oh, yeah. I mean, Trump won 51% of the vote, which is clearly not a huge victory. And what they're really doing now is trying to get a head start. You get all those volunteers in place. You get the staffers in place. My goodness, they've got a whole campaign communications team. The idea that they have a communications team on the ground in Iowa is just astounding to someone who covered the 2016 campaign when, I mean, it was hard to get anybody on the phone there.
That's so fascinating and such a difference from what you covered in 2016. I thought your point was really interesting about the visuals on caucus night, because you're right. We will be with all of these Democratic candidates. We'll be trying to talk to voters coming in and out of the caucus site to see where they are with the Democratic candidates. And Trump is obviously someone who's quite visual. Your point about trying to make sure that there's some level of energy, around his caucus sites, the Republican caucus sites, is really fascinating to me. What does the campaign say about trying to create just that overall energy around him right now? Do they feel like there is Republican energy, or are they having to work really hard to try to get Republicans, on board, up to speed on where this campaign is?
Well, look, they say that they are very confident. Every statement coming from this campaign is very, very rah-rah, very kind of Trumpy in its exuberant confidence. And they point specifically again and again to the backlash against the ongoing impeachment trial against the president, pointing to, they've had a tremendous number of small dollar donations coming in. They say that they've seen a flood of volunteers across the country of people who are angry about the impeachment and supporting the campaign as a result. That said, if you are that confident, you've got a campaign now that today announced that they are sending more than 80 surrogates to Iowa on Monday. And I mean, they are sending everybody, most of the cabinet, the acting chief of staff, all of these Republican officials, House members. We've got conservative Christian activists like Jerry Falwell. We even have My Pillow Guy is going to be there in the state stumping for Trump. And so in one case, that's definitely a show of force, a show of power. But you also wonder, if you're so confident about what's going to happen, why are you spending all of this time and resources?
One thing that certainly is working in the president's favor is that there was chatter, certainly in Washington a couple months ago, that you could have a Republican launch a serious primary challenge to the president. And we've seen a few Republicans, Bill Weld, one of them who's been campaigning in New Hampshire, who have tried to do this, but nothing has really stuck. Is the president's team pretty confident at this point that they have successfully managed to hold off any kind of late challenge to him?
Very much so, and that's not an accident. There are a number of states that aren't even going to be holding primaries and caucuses because the president's team made very clear that he would prefer if he didn't have any opportunities for challengers. The Trump campaign has worked essentially since the day the president was elected to try to make sure that there were no viable Republican challengers. He's somebody who's historically unpopular among, general election voters, but quite popular among Republicans. But nonetheless, despite that, they have been working at the state party level, attending the local and state conventions, making sure that all of those delegates who head to the convention are hardcore Trump supporters so that they don't risk any kind of embarrassment on the convention floor like they feared would happen in 2016 when a lot of those delegates wound up actually being Ted Cruz supporters.
That was an amazing scene at the 2016 convention when Ted Cruz got up on stage and told people to vote their conscience. Now it is very much Donald Trump's party. I do want to ask you about Mike Pence. You mentioned the vice president. He's going to be on a bus tour in Iowa in the lead up to this caucus. What does the Trump campaign envision as his role in the re-elect?
Well, Mike Pence has been on the road a lot. He's been doing a lot of these bus tours. He spent a lot of time on the road last year, really stumping on the USMCA, this new Canada-Mexico-U.S. trade deal, going to states like Pennsylvania and Wisconsin and Michigan, where trade is obviously very important, but also those states that are going to be crucial come November. And the vice president is somebody who kind of attracts a different kind of crowd than the president. He might not be able to kind of rev up the crowd the same way the president can. But he's also someone who, he goes to diners. The president, when he travels in, he'll land on Air Force One. He'll go straight into the rally. He'll do some pictures with folks backstage, maybe speak at a fundraiser, and then he's heading back to Washington. Pence is somebody who really seems to enjoy the sort of on-the-ground, kind of hand-to-hand campaigning that you typically see in these early voting states. So he'll drop by the diner. He'll make a joke about not telling his wife about the milkshake he's drinking. He really likes to talk to people. He appeals to a different kind of corner of the electorate. He seems to be very very popular with evangelical Christians. He's somebody who can really kind of talk the establishment Republican talk that the president hasn't really spent his whole life doing.
You've had a couple great stories, Jill, over the last couple of weeks about all of the different constituencies that the Trump campaign is trying to court. Evangelicals, who you mentioned, have been a key part of the president's base, but they're also looking to build beyond that. Where are some of the focuses for the campaign in the next couple of months?
Well, they're really trying to cover all of their bases here. They've got a Black Voices for Trump group. They've got a Latinos for Trump. They've got a Women for Trump group that has been, traveling across the country, doing bus tours already. Trump's campaign in 2016, also had sort of a coalitions program to try to do this kind of outreach. But a lot of people, just to be frank, kind of saw that as lip service. This time around, the campaign is really investing serious money. They're planning to spend, tens of millions of dollars on this effort. The Black Voices for Trump coalition, they've already spent $1 million so far on events. And what you see here is the campaign, they know this is going to be close, and they are trying to eke out every vote they possibly can. They know that they've got the hardcore Trump supporters, those base voters. But what they hope is that they'll be able to expand that base. And, the campaign talks a lot about the people who turn out at Trump's rallies, sort of the media narrative that these are all, folks who voted for Trump last time around, the folks who, if Trump shot someone on Fifth Avenue, would still vote for him. And what they're actually seeing in their data is that there are a lot of new voters coming in to those groups, folks who didn't vote 4 years ago, who are maybe now considering the president folks who are not registered Republicans. And so they're really hoping that they can make some movement on those margins to try to rack up the numbers.
Pulling Trump fans into Trump voters, essentially.
Exactly.
I think it's really an interesting strategy on their part because this likely will be a close general election. And it's not, I assume, the Trump campaign's plan to win the majority of Black voters, for example. But if you picked off 1 or 2% more in a state like Michigan or a state like Pennsylvania, that makes a big difference in a close election.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, if you can win over, a couple thousand voters in one district and a couple thousand voters in another, you can really, potentially carve out this map.
So the president is obviously paying close attention to the candidates who are trying to run against him in November. What does he make of the Democratic field at this point?
It's been interesting to kind of watch the progression and see the way that he has tried to respond to the polls, which have kind of been very, volatile. Mike Bloomberg is clearly the candidate who is in the president's head at the moment. Look, this is a president who watches quite a bit of television, and Mike Bloomberg is on television.
Every time I turn on television, Michael Bloomberg is on television.
You cannot avoid him. And that's the same case for the president, who is seeing his ads again and again, seeing the attacks that Bloomberg is launching against him. And these are two New York guys who spent a lot of time together. They've worked together in the past. They sort of have that similar background. And it really seems like Bloomberg is currently in the president's head. Since the beginning, the Trump campaign has really felt like they would be most competitive against, Bernie Sanders or even Elizabeth Warren. The campaign has sort of made this case that even if you don't like the president, even if you don't like the tweets, you don't like, the way that he operates, just look at how you're doing now versus 4 years ago. Look at the economy. And their argument has been if you elect somebody who is too liberal, that they could wind up damaging, the economy. You could, lose your job. They kind of try to paint this very bleak picture of what the economy would look like under, a progressive Democrat. And so as a result, they're more concerned about the Bloombergs of the world, or obviously Joe Biden.
It certainly is interesting to look at the stats for presidents running for a second term when the economy is strong. Trump has that to his advantage for sure. And we will see what a well-funded Trump campaign looks like, get our first glimpse of it in the lead up to the Iowa caucuses in the next couple of days. Jill Colvin, White House reporter for the AP, thank you so much for laying it all out for us.
Thanks for having me.
That's it for this episode of Ground Game. We're here twice a week, giving you all the latest election news from the Beltway and beyond. Be sure to tell a friend about us, and please subscribe, rate, and review wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening. From the Westwood One Podcast Network.